Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our ABAWD webinar training series. My name is Amber Bonilla, and I am a manager in the CalFresh policy section over the ABAWD policy unit. Before we get started, I just want to do a quick check to make sure that folks can hear us okay. So if someone could reply in the question box that you can hear our audio okay, that would be great before we get started with content. Okay, great. I'm seeing responses. Perfect. Thank you so much. So again, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning as we continue on in our series by discussing counting months of ABAWD participation. I'm joined today by our staff members of the ABAWD policy unit, Sydney Skellinger, and our newest member, Danielle Watkins-McGee. As a quick reminder, if you missed the first three webinars, that's okay. They were recorded. And the recordings have been posted to the CalFresh website, and we'll also be sending out an email at the end of this presentation with all links to the recordings as well as the PowerPoint presentations attached. If you'd like to request materials outside of that, please feel free to send myself, Sydney, or Danielle an email, and our contact information is listed at the end of the presentation. Okay. As always, this webinar will be held in listen-only mode, and there are two ways to listen in, either via your computer or via phone, and the information on how to connect is on the right-hand side of your screen. We've reserved some time at the end of the presentation for participants to ask questions, so if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so at any time using the question box throughout the presentation. At the end, we will address as many questions as time permits, and we'll be keeping a record of all questions asked in order to inform future webinar presentations, and we'll do our best to answer questions offline as well. For those questions that we're unable to get to, we'll keep a running list and release that at the end of the series. And also please note that along with the other webinars, this webinar will be recorded and all materials will be provided after the presentation. As we have stated in previous webinars, the return of the time limit is one of the most significant and complicated policy changes to impact CalFresh in quite some time. It's a very complex rule, and for that reason, we have proactively planned and prepared for implementation through this ABAWD webinar training series. This chart just shows a quick overview of what we have planned for the next couple of months. Each webinar in the series is meant to provide our partners with a starting point in developing their understanding of the ABAWD time limit, as well as to aid in the development of their own trainings. So next month, we will be hosting a webinar on regaining eligibility, followed by 15% exemption policy, and we'll be ending our series with the ABAWD clock reporting and meds. On today's agenda, we'll briefly revisit California's implementation timeline and review the ABAWD time limit rule. From there, we'll have an in-depth discussion on countable months, including identifying a countable month and tracking countable months, and we'll end with some key discussion points and Q&A. So while some of this information might be familiar if you joined us on our last webinar, we wanted to start off with some of the important dates in our implementation timeline just to sort of level set for everyone who's watching this morning. So with that, I will pass it along to Sydney.
All right, good morning, everyone. It is important that we all are on the same page regarding where we are in pre-implementation efforts and where we are headed. As mentioned last time, we are now less than 1 year away from implementation, and implementation is really just around the corner. On January 1 of this year, we officially started our new fixed statewide clock option for ABAWDs. As you recall, this means that each ABAWD has the same 36-month period. Since then, various ABAWD work groups and committees have been meeting regularly to work through key policy issues, draft the ABAWD handbook, develop new NOAAs, forms, and tools for ABAWD clients. This work culminates with the release of our ABAWD handbook, which should be happening soon. Looking ahead to next year, work groups and trainings will continue, and counties should begin planning any necessary business process changes and trainings they may need. If you are interested in joining a work group, please feel free to send an email to myself, Amber, or Danielle, and we will add you to the distribution list. 6 months ahead of implementation, we enter a phase of critical preparation. At this point in the timeline, counties should have a sense of their time limit waiver eligibility and whether or not they will be implementing the ABAWD time limit. In between this point and the loss of the statewide waiver on September 1st, counties who will be losing the waiver should be focused on educating their staff and communicating with clients, including thorough exemption screenings and notifications about the timeline rule. On September 1, 2018, the statewide waiver expires and some counties will be required to implement the time limit. Also, for those counties required to implement the time limit, participation tracking begins. Looking forward from there, in December, we will have wrapped up year 2 of our first 36-month period, and the first wave of ABAWD subject to the time limit may be potentially discontinued due to the exhaustion of their 3 countable months. To put things into perspective, we would like to reference our favorite diagram of the CalFresh population in relation to ABAWDs. For review, this diagram shows how at this point in the series we have narrowed down our population to the ABAWDs that are not exempt and therefore subject to the time limit. This means that an ABAWD must satisfy the work requirement in order to remain eligible for CalFresh. First, we have the largest bubble, which is our general CalFresh population. All CalFresh recipients fall into this bubble. The next bubble is which shows that subset of our CalFresh population are identified as work registrants. Narrowing further into this diagram shows that our ABAWD population is a subset of our work registration population. And finally, the last bubble, we have those ABAWDs who do not meet the criteria for either work registration, or a ABAWD exemption, and thus are subject to the time limit. We discussed this population in the last webinar when we learned about how these ABAWDs can satisfy the work requirement. Today we'll be discussing how to identify and establish countable months of participation for ABAWDs. Another quick review. Before we get started on our topic today, we wanted to remind everyone that ABAWD eligibility is limited to 3 full months of CalFresh within a 36-month period while not fulfilling the work requirement or otherwise exempt. This time limit applies to individuals that are 18 to 49, have no dependents, do not qualify for an exemption. The time limit rule requires that ABAWDs to work or participate in a qualifying work activity for at least 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month on average. All right. A recap of our training series so far. For those of you who have just joined us today or maybe missed the last trainings in our series, we wanted to start with a quick recap of the webinar series thus far to tie in today's topic with the broader discussion we've had over the last few months. We started with an ABAWD 101 presentation where we presented a high-level overview of ABAWD policy and time-limited participation. We then took a deep dive into ABAWD's exemptions and how some individuals who are considered ABAWDs may not be subject to the time limit if they meet certain exemption requirements. As we discussed, this is one of the most crucial steps in implementing the ABAWD time limit. We know from experience of other states that roughly half to 2/3 of ABAWD population is typically exempt from the time limit. And then last month, we discussed how those individuals who do not meet the required criteria for an exemption can satisfy the ABAWD work requirement through employment or other qualifying activities. The main focus of that webinar was to understand that an ABAWD must be involved in qualifying work activity for an average of 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month, and that many work activities can be combined to satisfy this work requirement. As mentioned a few minutes ago, today we will be discussing counting months of ABAWD participation for those individuals who are subject to the time limit, but who do not satisfy the work requirement. Now I'm going to pass it to Danielle, our newest ABAWD policy analyst, who will be discussing counting months.
Good morning, everyone. So first, we are going to start discussing what a countable month actually is. So what are countable months? A countable month is any month in which an ABAWD who is subject to the time limit receives a full month of CalFresh benefits while not exempt from the 3-month time limit, fulfilling ABAWD work requirements, living in a waged county, or exempt due to receiving one of the 15% exemptions. In order to be considered a countable month, the month must be a full benefit month. Months in which an ABAWD receives a prorated benefit allotment are not considered countable towards the 3-month time limit. A month is considered countable if the ABAWD was not satisfying the work requirement and did not meet the criteria for an exemption at any point during the month. Countable months do apply towards the ABAWD time limit. So to review, remember that ABAWDs are limited to 3 full months of benefits within the 36-month time period. An ABAWD that has exhausted their 3 countable months during the 36-month time period and is not meeting the work requirement or otherwise exempt will be ineligible and discontinued from receiving CalFresh benefits. So how do we establish a countable month? Now that we know what is considered a countable month and how to identify them, how do we actually put this into practice? There are a few ways in which the CWD may establish that an individual has indeed used a countable month. The first being that ABAWDs subject to the time limit have an additional mandatory mid-period reporting requirement. They are to inform the county of a reduction in work hours below 20 hours per week for a total of 80 hours monthly within 10 days of the date the reduction in work hours became known to the household. If the CWD receives a required mid-period report from an individual, they should first determine that the person did not meet the criteria for an exemption or had good cause for not satisfying the work requirement. If it is determined that the person did not have good cause or meet an exemption criteria, then the CWD will assign a countable month. In a limited number of scenarios, it may already be known to the county when an individual fails to satisfy the ABAWD work requirement. For example, if an individual fails to complete the necessary hours in a CalFresh employment and training program, or they fail to complete the required hours they have been assigned for workfare, the CWD will already have access to this information. It is considered known to the county. Once the CWD has confirmed that the participant has not satisfied the work requirement for the month, the CWD may establish a countable month. Note that countable months follow an ABAWD through the length of the 36-month period. We must track an ABAWD who is subject to the time limit, who moves between counties or even between states. Some individuals may have moved from a different county where they used a countable month. In these cases, they will have the tracking code N in their 36-month record, which indicates the use of a countable month. Tracking codes are sent by the statewide automated welfare system to MEDS, and this record is accessible by every CWD statewide. We will be discussing inter-county transfers and moving between counties later in the presentation, and we will discuss tracking ABAWD participation in depth in a future webinar. For now, know that a county has the responsibility to reference an ABAWD's record of the 36-month period to determine whether the ABAWD used a countable month sometime earlier in the 36-month period. And finally, for ABAWDs subject to the time limit, applying for CalFresh, who have moved to California from another state that is also implementing the time limit, the CWD must determine if any countable months were used out of state during the 36-month period. We will also discuss this on the next slide. So as I mentioned, I will now discuss the use of countable months out of a state. So a countable month can be accrued in California or in another state that is implementing the ABAWD time limit. If there is an indication that an ABAWD subject to the time limit receives SNAP benefits in another state, the CWD must verify the use of any countable months in the other state at application. If necessary, the individual's meds record must be updated, even if the client is residing in a time limit waiver area in California at the time of application. If there is evidence that an individual subject to the ABAWD time limit receives SNAP benefits in another state, the CWD must verify countable months used while residing in the other state. If the ABAWD accrued countable months during California's current 36-month period, the CWD must update the client's record in meds to reflect the countable months that were used in the other state. Acceptable verification from the other state agency includes a written or verbal statement, which must be notated in the case record, or a printed image of the individual's record of the 36-month period indicating countable months used in the other state. So this slide is going to present a visual representation of the 36-month calendar. Each month in the 36-month period requires a code which represents the ABAWD's participation status in that particular month. So you can see some of the common tracking codes and explanations located under the calendar, and we will be showing a few more examples of this 36-month calendar. So please follow along from left to right, top to bottom. In this example, we have an ABAWD that moved to California from a state that was on the same fixed clock but had different exemptions. So say we have Joe, who is a chronically homeless ABAWD that was receiving benefits in Idaho until the end of June 2019. As you can see, while living in Idaho, he was ineligible to receive benefits from January 2017 through September 2018. This is represented by tracking code 9. Joe was not exempt from the time limit while in Idaho because Idaho does not explicitly exempt chronically homeless individuals as unfit or unable to work as California does. In October 2018, Joe received a partial prorated month of benefits. This is represented by tracking code P. And then he used his 3 countable months consecutively in November, December, and January. This is represented by tracking code N. Since he had exhausted his 3 countable months, he was ineligible to receive benefits for the remainder of the 36-month period. Joe moved to California in July of 2019 and applied for CalFresh benefits. At application, the CWD verified that Joe used his 3 countable months in Idaho, as he lived in a non-wage area and did not meet the work requirement. The CWD updates Joe's meds record to reflect the 3 countable months Joe used in Idaho despite the difference in exemption policy. Now that Joe lives in California, his meds record is also updated to reflect that Joe is exempt for the current and future months in his certification period. This is represented by tracking code E. Notice that even though Joe would have been exempt had he been living in California, the CWD must still update his record to reflect that he used the 3 countable months within California's 36-month time period. So just to clarify this a step further, if Joe would not have been exempt due to being chronically homeless, he would have been subject to the time limit as soon as he moved to California in July 2019. So let's say Joe wasn't exempt and was required to meet the work requirement. Joe would have been ineligible to receive CalFresh benefits because he already used his 3 countable months within California's 36-month period. I'm now going to give an example of an ABAWD that moved from another state that was using a different fixed clock. So for starters, it's important to remember that if an ABAWD subject to the time limit was not exempt, and use the countable month in another state, the CWD must count that month, even if the client would have been exempt had they been receiving benefits in California. So in this example, we have Jane, an ABAWD who currently lives in Illinois and is subject to the time limit. Illinois is also using a fixed clock, but it runs from January 2019 to December 2021. Jane used her 3 countable months within the 36-month time period. Jane moved to California in January 2021. Because she moved to California, she is now on California's fixed clock. In this 36-month period, the California fixed clock started in January 2020 and runs through December 2022. For purposes of counting months, the CWD should only assess countable months used within California's 36-month time period. Jane used 2 countable months in 2017, which was within California's 36-month period. This means that she only has 1 countable month remaining within her California 36-month period. Notice that her 36-month period did not start over. It only converted to the California clock versus the Illinois clock. Jane is eligible to receive 1 more countable month, which she uses in July 2022. At this point, Jane has now exhausted all of her countable months for the California 36-month time period. So I'll now go over some examples for identifying countable months. The first example, we have a non-exempt client that is 49 years of age and completed 15 hours of work activity each week this month. Is this a countable month? This would be a countable month because the client is not exempt from the time limit. They did not meet any exemption criteria. They are not receiving a 15% exemption, and they failed to meet the work requirement, which requires an average of 20 hours a week for a total of 80 hours per month. This client only satisfied 60 hours of the required 80. In our second example, we have a client who is not meeting the work requirement, not otherwise exempt, and not receiving a 15% exemption, and they did receive a full month of CalFresh benefits. Is this a countable month? This is also a countable month because the individual received a full month of benefits, but is not meeting the work requirement, is not otherwise exempt, and is not receiving a 15% exemption. So how do we identify a non-countable month? It only makes sense that if a countable month is one that counts towards the 3-month time limit, then a non-countable month does not count towards the 3-month time limit. A non-countable month includes any month in which the individual meets the work requirement. This can be done by working an average of 20 hours per week for a total of 80 hours in a month, or by participating in and complying with the requirements of a work program for an average of 20 hours per week for a total of 80 hours per month. Feel free to review the last webinar as a reminder of what qualifies and can be counted towards meeting the work requirement. Identifying a non-countable month, it can also be any month that has been prorated. Individuals applying for CalFresh benefits after the first day of the month aren't likely to receive the full benefit for that month. They instead receive a prorated amount for the number of days remaining in the month for which they applied. This partial prorated month is non-countable. A month is also non-countable if the ABAWD turns 50 during any part of the month. It is also non-countable if the ABAWD qualifies for an exemption at any point during the month. Lastly, a month is non-countable if the ABAWD is receiving a 15% exemption or if they had good cause for not satisfying the work requirement. We will now review what is considered to be good cause. So we discussed a good cause during our last webinar when we talked about satisfying the work requirement. But just to recap, when you receive information that a client did not satisfy the work requirement, either through a mandatory report or if the information is known to the county, remember to first assess if the individual had good cause. Good cause may be determined for households that fail to satisfy the work requirement for reasons outside of their control. This can include, but is not limited to, an illness, which can be personal or the illness of another household member. It can also be a household emergency. This can include a burst pipe, a fire, or a power blackout. It can also include lack of transportation. As a reminder, CWD should assess for good cause prior to applying a countable month or a 15% exemption. Months in which good cause is established do not count towards the 3-month time limit. A rule of thumb to remember when assessing for good cause is to ask yourself, would the ABAWD have satisfied the work requirement had this event not taken place? If the answer is yes, then good cause should be applied. Good cause provisions can be found at MPP 63-410.221 and 63-407.51. So I'll go over some examples now of a non-countable month to paint a better picture of what these months are. So in the first example, we have a non-exempt client who applies for benefits on September 2nd after being laid off. Is this month countable? This would not be a countable month because the client will only receive a partial prorated amount of CalFresh benefits for the remainder of the month. Remember that in order for a month to be countable, they must receive a full month of CalFresh benefits. In our second example, we have a client that has been consistently satisfying the work requirement and has never used a countable month, but catches the flu on December 13th. The individual must miss work due to illness and is unable to work his planned 80 hours for that month. They will not be able to meet the work requirement for the month of December. Would this month be countable? This also would not be a countable month. Due to the client's illness, they have good cause for not meeting the work requirement for the month. Illness is outside of the ABAWD's control. Had they not been sick, the client would have met the 80 hours per month requirement. This client still has 3 countable months for this 36-month period. So how do we track these countable months? CWDs must track an individual ABAWD's use of their 3 countable months within a 36-month period. Participation will be tracked using various tracking codes, which indicate the ABAWD status as it relates to the ABAWD time limit for each month. As it was mentioned earlier, tracking codes will be discussed and explained in more detail in a later webinar in this series. As of right now, a tracking code of N indicates the use of a countable month. It is also important to note that countable months do not need to be used consecutively. Individual circumstances may cause them to use their 3 countable months during non-consecutive months. We will have some examples of what this may look like in just a few minutes. It is also very important to remember that the record remains with the individual even if they become a member of a different CalFresh household. Only when a new 36-month period begins does an individual ABAWD get a new record of the 36-month period in Med. So as it was mentioned in the last slide, individuals do not have to use their countable months consecutively and may experience breaks in participation. CWDs must track countable months over the 36-month period, even if there are breaks in an ABAWD's participation. There are several reasons why an ABAWD might have a break in participation. This can include temporarily finding sufficient employment. They may qualify for an exemption. They may have stopped participating in CalFresh for a period of time, or they may have experienced other circumstances that may have caused them to use their 3 countable months non-consecutively. We will now review a couple samples of a 36-month record.
All right. I will be going over a couple of samples of a 36-month record. This first one that we're going to talk about is what this first 36-month period is going to look like. Just as a point of reference, this graph is to be read from left to right for each year that it's used, and then starting from the columns going down from top to bottom. All right, so as we mentioned before, each month in the 36-month period requires a code which represents the ABAWD's participation status in that particular month. We will be discussing tracking codes and details in an upcoming webinar, but we just want to give you an example of what it's going to look like for counting months. In this example, this is an existing ABAWD client who is already receiving CalFresh benefits. From January 2017 until August 2018, the ABAWD is living in a waived area, as the whole state of California is under a statewide waiver, and therefore is not subject to the time limit, and this is represented by tracking code Z. Starting September 2018, because this is when the statewide waiver expires, the ABAWD receives 3 countable months of benefits consecutively in September, October, and November of 2018. And this is indicated by tracking code N in the dark orange boxes. The ABAWD was discontinued in December 2018 because they exhausted their 3 countable months and were not satisfying the work requirement. The ABAWD was also ineligible in January, which is represented by tracking code 9. In February of 2019, the ABAWD regained eligibility by satisfying the work requirement for 30 consecutive days, reapplied for CalFresh, and received a partial or prorated month of CalFresh benefits indicated by tracking code P. The ABAWD then continued to satisfy the work requirement and received benefits from March 2019 to July 2019. These months would not count towards the time limit because the ABAWD satisfied the work requirement. This is represented by tracking code W. In August 2019, the ABAWD was no longer meeting the work requirement, and the CWD determined that the ABAWD should receive their one-time 3 consecutive months of CalFresh benefits. This is represented by tracking code C. Next month, we will be discussing regaining eligibility, including the 3 consecutive month provision. In November of 2019, they were once again meeting the work requirement and continued to do so for the remainder of this 36-month period. And this is again represented by tracking code W. The 36-month record will completely reset January 2020. An example of a reset calendar, 36-month calendar, will be shown on the next slide. All right. So this slide presents a visual representation of an ABAWD that does not use their countable months consecutively. This is a visual of a 36-month period starting January 2020. Like before, you're going to read it from left to right and then top to bottom for our 3-year period. In this example, this ABAWD uses their first countable month, the first month of the 36-month period, which was January 2020. This is represented by the tracking code N. They were meeting the work requirement beginning February 2020 through August 2020. These months do not count towards the time limit because the ABAWD satisfied the work requirement, and this is represented by tracking code W. They were determined ineligible to receive CalFresh benefits until January 2020 and 2021, and this was represented by tracking code 9. They could have been inactive for various reasons, such as not completing their recertification, receiving income over their IRT or income reporting threshold, or they moved out of the state. Notice that when they reapply for CalFresh benefits, they only receive a partial month of benefits in January of 2021, and this is represented by tracking code P. This means that they did not apply on the 1st and did not receive a full month of benefits. Therefore, this will not be a countable month because only a full month of benefits will be counted towards the time limit. They begin meeting the work requirement until May of 2021, which is when they use their second countable month. Again, this is represented by the tracking code N. They again were meeting the work requirement until October of 2021, which is when they used the third and final countable month of this 36-month period. They met the work requirement again until July of 2022, and at this time, since they used their 3 countable months and lost eligibility, they are now eligible for their one-time 3 consecutive months benefit, which is represented by tracking code CCC, but it's not on there. Because they used their 3 countable months, they are no longer meeting the work requirement and did not live in a waived area and was not otherwise exempt. They were ineligible to receive CalFresh benefits for the rest of the 36-month period. This calendar will reset come January 2023, and they will again be eligible to receive their 3 countable months of CalFresh benefits. All right, now we have when an ABAWD moves within the state. So due to regional differences in unemployment rates, certain counties or areas within counties may retain their time limit waiver. Moving between waived and non-waived areas within the 36-month period does not restart their 3-month time limit. An ABAWD's record remains with them even if they move to a county that is under a time limit waiver. If an ABAWD has used any countable months during the 36-month period, those countable months will count towards the individual's 3-month time limit, regardless of the ABAWD's movement between waived or non-waived counties. That is why the individual's record of the 36-month period remains with the individual until a new 36-month period begins. That said, counting months starts and stops based on waiver eligibility of that area where the individual resides within the 36-month period. Months of benefits received while in a waiver area does not count towards the 3-month time limit. 36-month records will be viewable on MEDS, so no matter what consortium the ABAWD is living in, they can still be seen. All right. Now we have moving to a waived area. When an ABAWD moves to an area that is waived, the ABAWD is no longer subject to the time limit. The individual does not need to meet the work requirement or verify exemption eligibility. If the individual was previously disqualified for exhausting their 3 countable months, the disqualification must be lifted and they may again receive CalFresh if they are otherwise eligible. ABAWDs must still be tracked when moving to a waived area. All right, so now that we've talked about moving to a waived area, now we have to discuss moving to a non-waived area. If an ABAWD moves from a waived area to a non-waived area during the 36-month period, the ABAWD will become subject to the time limit if they do not meet the criteria for an exemption. An individual is now subject to the time limit and must meet the work requirement, receive a 15% exemption, or otherwise be exempt while residing in a non-waived area. If they fail to meet one of these requirements, they will be assigned a countable month for each full month of benefits they receive.
Okay, so we will now talk about inter-county transfer implications. So per ACL 1122, when a household that contains a member that is an ABAWD subject to the time limit moves to a non-waived county and an inter-county transfer is completed, the the receiving county is responsible for determining whether the ABAWD is satisfying the work requirement the month the ICT is completed. This applies unless the receiving county is under a time limit waiver, in which case the ABAWD must be tracked, but does not need to satisfy the requirement the month the ICT is completed. An example of this would be an ABAWD that was residing part of the month in a waiver county. The receiving county should completely screen the ABAWD for any possible exemptions. The receiving county is now responsible for the ABAWD until they move again. So we'll talk more about ICT tracking. Generally, the receiving county is responsible for tracking the ABAWD the month in which the ICT is completed and moving forward, which is typically until the ABAWD moves again. The receiving county must determine the ABAWD status and complete the corresponding tracking, whether the receiving county is a waived or non-waived county area. If the receiving county is a waived area, the SAWS for the receiving county will submit tracking code Z to MEDS. If the receiving county is a non-waived area, the SAWS for the receiving county will submit a tracking code indicating the ABAWD status the month of the ICT and moving forward. So this includes determining whether the ABAWD is satisfying the work requirement, whether the ABAWD is exempt, if they used accountable months, or if they're no longer eligible for benefits. As it was noted previously, a full record of the ABAWD's 36-month calendar is accessible in MEDS, and it should be referenced by the receiving county at the time the ICT is processed to aid in properly determining the individual's ABAWD status. So what happens to an ABAWD that exhausts their countable months? An ABAWD who has exhausted their countable months during the 36-month time period and is not otherwise exempt is ineligible for CalFresh benefits and will therefore be discontinued. So after the last countable month has been received, the ABAWD becomes ineligible to participate in CalFresh. If the ABAWD is part of a single CalFresh household, the case will be discontinued and no benefits will be received. If the ABAWD is part of a CalFresh household with other eligible members, the ineligible ABAWD will be excluded from the CalFresh benefits, and there will be a reduction in benefits received by that CalFresh household. Note that the ABAWD is still considered a part and a member of that CalFresh household, even if they are ineligible for benefits. The individual shall remain ineligible for the remainder of the 36-month period unless they satisfy the requirement for regaining eligibility, qualify for an ABAWD exemption, or move to a waiver county. So losing eligibility. CWDs must discontinue an ABAWD's CalFresh benefits with timely and adequate notice if they have exhausted their 3 countable months and met the time limit. CWDs must send the notice of discontinuance for failure to meet the ABAWD work requirement, informing the client of the discontinuance and explaining how the client may regain eligibility. This notice should be sent no later than 10 days into the month following the individual's 3rd countable month. If it is discovered that the client has used their 3rd countable month and the next month of benefits has already been issued, the CWD may assign a 15% exemption for the month following that 3rd month, determine that the ABAWD had good cause for failure to satisfy the work requirement, or establish an overissuance. In these instances, the CWD must notify the client that their case will be discontinued effective that next month. So here are a couple responsibilities of the CWD. It is the responsibility of the CWD to explain all ABAWD requirements to the CalFresh household For starters, this includes explaining which individuals are currently subject to the ABAWD requirements, which individuals are potential ABAWDs, even if the individual is exempt at the time of application, the 36-month period fixed time clock, the ABAWD's 3 countable months, sorry about that, ABAWD exemptions, and how to satisfy the work requirement. The CWD should also explain to the household that regardless of mandatory reporting, the failure to report a change in ABAWD status during the certification period while the clock is running can result in an overissuance, a 15% exemption, or the discontinuance of benefits for the ABAWD. Remember that the CWD wants to be engaged with the client in order to maximize eligibility. Even though ABAWDs are not required to report a change in their exemption status, reporting that they are exempt from the time limit is to their benefit. So here are a few key takeaway discussion points to remember as we're coming to a close. Ensure that only full months of CalFresh benefits are being counted towards an ABAWD 36 time limit. Ensure that proper screening is completed to identify months that are non-countable. Ensure that months are retroactively being counted or uncounted. And ensure that correct tracking codes are being used to establish ABAWD status. It's also important to remember that the receiving county is responsible for tracking the ABAWD status. Countable months can be accrued in any state. An ABAWD will be discontinued after they exhaust their 3 countable months, and ABAWDs should receive timely and adequate notice upon losing eligibility. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. At this time, we're going to open up the floor for questions. Just as a reminder, submit your questions in the question box, and we will be keeping a record of those questions that we can't get to and follow up with responses.
Great. This is Amber again. So a lot of questions have come through, so I'm going to scroll back up to the top and kind of play MC here. So if you could just give us a minute. Okay, so the first question I'm seeing is, if the application date is on January 1, 2019, and the ABAWD reports getting a job on January 20th and works 30 hours in January, is January considered a countable month?
Okay, so to answer this question, it actually depends. January is a countable month if the ABAWD received a full month of benefits on that day of application. So I know there are some counties that have the accessibility to issue benefits the same day. So if on January 1, when they came in, they received a full month that same day, if they're not exempt when they call in on January 20, and since they did less than 80 hours in work-related activities for the month, this would be a countable month. So using the same scenario in January, it would not be a countable month if the month was prorated or a partial month. That response would be different. So if the filing date was on January 2nd or later, it would be a partial prorated month, and it wouldn't be countable even if the ABAWD didn't or did satisfy the work requirement.
Great, thank you. So another question came in, Danielle, and this person asked to confirm, which you kind of just mentioned this, a prorated month of benefits, either at intake STAR 7, recert, or mid-period, would not apply as a countable month. Is that correct?
That is correct. A prorated partial month will never count as a countable month.
Great. And this next question asks, is the county required to closely track hours for a county work program such as workfare? Or is the county permitted to rely on the ABAWD to report dropping below 20 hours per week for a county work program?
So for the county programs like Workfare, that's one of those things where it might automatically be known to the county. So the county might already have that information on hand. It would be the ABAWD's responsibility to communicate those hours with the county. Just as the mandatory reporting says, they are they are required to report a drop in hours of less than 20.
Yes, that's correct. So I'll just jump in here too. So because I've also been answering questions offline a little bit, and so for programs like Workfare, yes, the county would be responsible for tracking those hours with the county administered program, but I think what Danielle is mentioning is, for example, those clients that may be using like a qualifying work activity along with employment are still going to be subject to that mandatory reporting requirement. Great. Someone asked when the handbook will be released, and the handbook has been released for stakeholder review, and it's on track pending review and revision to be released in November. So that's coming. And let's just give me another minute here to look through questions. Okay, great. One other question came in that if a client was living in a waived county and then moved to a non-waived county, let's say on December 15th, and they did not participate in the ABAWD work requirement, or I'm assuming this means they did not meet the work requirement for the remainder of December, would this still be considered a countable month?
So for this example, this would not be a countable month for the month of December, because for part of that month they were living in a waived area. So they will be required to satisfy the work requirement beginning in January, since this was in December, unless they are exempt. It cannot be a countable month if at any point during the month they were living in a waived county.
Great. This next question is, if a client is moving from the state or from a state that still has a statewide ABAWD waiver, all the months in which they received SNAP benefits in that state will not be counted. Is that correct?
Correct, because that state was under a waiver.
Great.
We're going to still track those months, but those months won't be counted because that state was under a waiver.
Perfect. And then just filtering through. This is a question about good cause, and it's asking for illness of a household member or a family member. They're giving the example, if an ABAWD's mom who happens to live in another county had to, if that ABAWD had to leave to take care of her, would this be considered good cause?
This would be good cause. If that ABAWD was going to meet the work requirement, had they not gone to take care of their mother, then that would be a good cause month.
Great, perfect. And then someone asked the question as a clarification question, I believe, of the tracking codes, and they were asking about the difference between an N code and a C code.
So we'll go over the C codes in more depth in the next webinar. It'll be on regaining eligibility, and that's kind of when those consecutive months come into play. So I know they weren't discussed much in detail in this webinar, but you will be able to get a more broader picture of what it looks like and how to put those into play when an ABAWD regains their eligibility.
Perfect. Okay, some more questions have come in, so just give us 1 minute. And looking at the time, it looks like we may have time for just one more. So let me scroll down here to see these new ones that have just come in. Okay, so this one asks, what if the ABAWD disagrees with the receipt of a countable month? Do they have a right to a hearing? So I'll take a stab at this one and say that clients do always have a right to request a hearing when they disagree with the county's decision. But I think it's important to remember here, and we've mentioned this in previous webinars, that ABAWDs can provide proof if they did in fact satisfy the work requirement, if they had good cause, or to show that they were exempt in the month. So if they do provide proof to the county that they did in fact meet the work requirement, or if it can be established that they had good cause or met exemption criteria, then the county is able to remove the countable month code and update the 36-month record. So looking at the time, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I just want to thank everyone again so much for their participation. And just a reminder that the upcoming webinars we have next month will be regaining eligibility, followed by 15% exemption policy, and then ending the series with the ABAWD clock reporting and meds. And as always, we have some resources listed here for you. And thank you so much again for your participation, and be on the lookout for an email from us with the recording and presentation materials attached. Thank you so much.